welcome to another episode of the Future Tech podcast series. We're now into series 4, where it's me, Charlie Sell, the Group MD of Arrows Group, and I'm interviewing, speaking to thought leaders, senior people within our tech space, fintech, banking, as well as e-commerce and high-tech, high-growth companies, asking them, as always, a bit about their story, focusing on a bit that's important to them, whether that's emerging technology or specifically about what their business is doing, and finishing on that all-important career advice for many of our STEM listeners as we are preparing ourselves for our journey into employment. So really pleased to have Nick Funnell with me today. Nick is the VP of Engineering at S4Ep5. And for those who don't know S4Ep5, they're a global fintech consultancy, a challenger consultancy, many would say, in how they work with their end clients, really adding value. And something we'll talk about later in the podcast, maybe looking at how they're building or helping the fintech space, building it from the inside out. So lots of good content there. And as always, we'll start with our opening question. So Nick, welcome to the show.
Hi there, good to be here.
And let's jump straight into it. Let's find out a bit about your career history, your VP of Engineering. How did it all start and your career to date?
Gosh, yes, it started some time ago. So I studied engineering at university. I wish I could pretend there was some grand plan, but there really wasn't. I've been sort of winging it all the way along. I think towards the end of university, I went and had a look at on the sort of the milk brand few companies, and I ended up working for a bank. And I think it was because the banks seemed very interested in technology, and they sort of they put on a good show. They gave us good food and drink at the presentation, and I ended up working for UBS in private banking, actually, IT. Really good place to start, full of lots of really good people, really smart people. So that's where I kind of started out and then became a sort of Java developer. And since then I've worked in banks throughout my entire career. So I've worked in credit risk and market risk, and then most lately at cloud for one of the major banks, sort of moving us to AWS. So I've done loads of stuff in technology, been really interested. And then lastly, I've been lucky enough to kind of end up at S4Ep5, where I think they do all the things we're able to work in a way that I could never really work out in a bank, because they're so sort of big and it's difficult to get things done. They move tend to move at a fairly slow pace, I guess. So I mean, the great thing for me is we can work agile in the way that you should work. We can kind of limit to sort of the frictions, etc. So yeah, and I'm sort of I guess my mission statement, if you like, is I'm trying to build the sort of environment for engineers that I would have loved when I was younger, if you like, where you're empowered, you're aware of the problems you're trying to solve, and you've got the ability to choose how to solve them.
Yeah, brilliant. And then that leads us straight nicely into thinking about the culture of teams, and it's something that we were discussing just before the podcast, wasn't it? The how you can empower engineers and how you can build teams moving forward now, taking into account A, the world changes, and B, how we all would have wanted to work. What really stands out with you when you're thinking about building your teams beneath you? What do you think are the most important things you want to get right to get that empowerment right?
I think it's very hard, very easy to get it wrong, shall we say. And I think in large organizations, it's kind of, I think engineering tends to be a little bit buried in the organization. And I think, in my experience, there were many situations where as an engineer, I was a long way away from the purpose of what I was actually doing. So, you get to a situation where you're writing code, you're sort of completing Jira tickets, etc., but you're not actually seeing the first-hand impact of what you're doing. And I think for me, I've reflected on this a lot, actually, and I kind of, I thought about where was I really energized in my career, and it was in those situations where you had like a production incident or you had a very tight deadline, and then the adrenaline gets going and it's very enjoyable. But then I reflected further and I realized that it wasn't the deadline that did it. It wasn't the pressure that did it. It was the fact that somebody cared. It was the fact that somebody needed this thing and was asking for it and was sort of desperate for it. And that's the purpose thing. And I don't know if you're sort of familiar with the Dan Pink, the Drive.
Oh, yeah.
He's got one of the most popular TED Talks, which you can find, all about how people don't do a job beyond a certain point for money. He talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Those are the three things that you need, if you like. And I reflected on this, and I thought, well, within a bank, you don't usually have a lot of autonomy because you've got a lot of rules and things you can and can't use. Mastery we tend to be quite good at, because an engineer, you'll find, will make a thing interesting for themselves. They'll say, oh well, I'll use this, or I'll tackle this to learn a skill. The mastery is building a skill, getting better at something. But it was the purpose that was lacking. You need to be doing something in the service of a higher power, if you like, delivering for someone who's saying thank you very much. And that's the bit that was missing for me from a lot of it. Or I guess there was purpose, but I wasn't getting that feedback loop. So I wasn't feeling the purpose for it. Obviously, I was doing it for a reason, but the reason wasn't necessarily clear to me. So I think where we're building teams, I like to work very closely with clients. Engineers, virtually in the current situation, but sitting side by side with product, with design, and with the clients, and actually showing what they're doing and iterating. I remember one situation when I was working in market risk. We happened to go over to sit next to the market data just to see them for a day, just to talk to them. The people we were building this thing for were in a different building. So my colleague and I sat next to them, and they were the lady who was sort of doing this job while we watched. Like, she was just doing something, finishing a job before she spoke to us, and she took this data and sort of put it into our application. And then kind of did this thing where she went backspace, comma, backspace, comma, backspace, comma, because it was a list of carriage returns separated, and she needed to turn it into a comma separated list. My colleague and I just looked at each other and went, "We could do that for you." And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" We could write the code to do that quicker than it takes you to do that. And we went and did it. So she didn't have that thing. But without actually sitting next to her and understanding what she was doing, we would never have done that. And she would never have asked, because she just worked around the problem. So that's I suppose, a small example of trying to sort of empower the engineers and the rest of the team to understand what the problem is and let them solve it in their own way. She didn't say, "I need this." She said, "This is my problem." And we then went away and did, "We can solve that in this way. How about that?" So that's kind of, for me, I suppose, the fundamental thing about sort of bringing the engineers close to the work they're doing, and then sort of seeking feedback on it.
And I just think that's a brilliant point, because the one thing I've seen that's changed over the years, and I'm not sure if you'll agree or not, is how engineering and technology, 10, 15 years ago was sort of seen as a service to the business rather than a profit to the business. And so it meant that even the personalities of people who went into engineering may have been reserved, introverted, in the fact that they just wanted to get on and code and do things on their own. However, that landscape, I believe, has changed now. And actually, the most successful engineers I know, they don't need to be extroverts, but that love of wanting to find out the value of what you're building and how that actually helps the business, and the business appreciating that drives profit or efficiency or better customer experience, which ultimately makes a company more valuable. Technology underpins that, and our engineers are critical nowadays to getting that right. Have you seen the same when you're thinking about the changing landscape of your teams and the type of people that are now coming through the ranks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always room for all sorts of personalities. My wife, when I first met my wife, she described me as a geek with social skills, which I wasn't sure whether to be sort of insulted by that or not. But I think, you have both. A lot of the work, we do with clients, obviously you need people who are willing to talk to a client, because I think you need to be able to articulate what you're doing. But not everybody needs to be able to do that. We also have people who actually, people who prefer to not talk to clients and actually to just do the work. So there's room for everybody. But I certainly think software has become democratized, shall we say. I think there's a lot more people coming into it. I think you've got children learning to code. My son he's sort of 7, he got things in school, like a little Minecraft thing where you write code to do Minecraft, which was, absolutely amazing. But I think almost software is going to be everybody's going to need that skill in the same way that everybody needs to be able to read and write. You probably need to understand a little bit. Not everybody will go into it, but I think it's becoming more of a common language rather than something done by people in the dark room.
Yeah. And I do agree, and I take your point that is the lovely thing about technology as a whole, that it does fit many different personalities and many different types of people. You've just got to make sure you're honest to yourself, and the teams know what your the cultural alignment needs to be there, I guess. And so moving on and thinking, we were speaking again before the podcast, that 11FS has just published quite a detailed report, Rebuilding Banking from the Inside, and really looking at how that's evolved. Are you able to share a few of the highlights from that for a number of the listeners wanting to know how that's changed over the past few years?
Sure. I mean, it's something that it's one of our sort of areas of sort of interest and expertise, I suppose, is sort of, challenger banks and helping the sort of the more traditional large organizations kind of move forward, build digital propositions, etc. So we've done a few reports over the years. We did one on banking as a service previously, but our most recent one, as you say, rebuilding banking from the inside. It's all about how we sort of banks need to sort of rethink their approach to architecture, I suppose. I mean, they're sort of the majority of the high street banks have been around for decades, and they're sort of built on core systems, written in COBOL, mainframe, which is sort of very monolithic, and you can't really change them, or if you do, it's incredibly high risk. And so, of course, over the last 30, 40 years, things have been layered on top and more layers, and we describe them as sort of sedimentary rock, if you like. These things are built on other things, and then the understanding's lost. And these things then become they work very well, they have to, but you don't really want to touch them or change them. And any sort of change you make is sort of very high risk. And if you then compare that to how software has gone, because of sort of the availability of cloud now, it's very quick and easy to sort of to get infrastructure in place. So the fintechs are building very fast. I can and have just taken my credit card, created an Amazon account, cloud account, and just deployed an application, and that's available to anybody in the world very cheaply for a few quid a month. If that became very popular, I could scale up very quickly as I'm sort of making more profit. So the banks are sort of having to compete with multiple organizations that are sort of slicing off bits of the pie, if you like, what do they say, eating their lunch, as it were. So I think with the banks, it's kind of about how they need to be able to match that pace of change. They need to be able to sort of operate. For me, I would describe it as sort of proportionate risk. If you're doing something, you need to be able to experiment without bringing the entire compliance of the bank down on something. Like if your maximum risk is $20, do you really have to take that to the regulators? If you can show that actually you're just doing an experiment to see how people use it. I think by sort of starting to modularize the architecture, you can then swap bits in and out, if you like, and you can evolve it over time. So, where there are fintech providers, providing sort of KYC or car payments or insights, etc., you can maybe plug those in. You can start to sort of carve off your existing legacy thing that isn't really fit for purpose now, and then you can plug the new thing in. So it's all about sort of decoupling and sort of making looser, but it's also to sort of this is, for me, it's critical at a business level. So this is not just, you alluded to it earlier, software is not just a cost anymore, it's a competitive advantage, and it has to be thought of as such. And I can talk for hours about the sort of the things the problems and the things I see. We have in banks, you'll have an annual budgeting cycle. So if you want to do some work, you have to prepare a case for it to get the budget. Now, if you decide, if you're being agile, you do an MVP and get that out after a few weeks, you might find that actually it's completely the wrong thing to do. But you've got the money now, so you then need to find a way to spend it, or wait for another year before you sort of pick another experiment. Yeah. So everything is geared to this very sort of slow, monolithic way of doing things. And if you've got money to change, that's like a change budget. So it's a project. So then you find you have to get this thing done to the end of the deadline as quickly as possible. And actually, to you, it doesn't necessarily matter how you're leaving the thing, as long as you've delivered on time and you can sort of celebrate and get your bonus or whatever. Whereas actually, it should be more about like curating a long-term product. You get a budget, you respond to the needs of your internal clients, but then you also use some of that for maintenance and sort of etc. So it's all these things need to change, but of course in a big organization it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a really valid point, the difference between the large organizations, traditional organizations, and then the competitive advantage that new well, challenger organizations have, I guess. And I think banking is probably one of the best examples, isn't it? From my limited knowledge of clients and people we work with, where you have your traditional institutions, UBS, Barclays, Credit Suisse, but now you have a number of these challenger banks coming through, Revolut, Monzo, where from my understanding, they're still using the infrastructure of a large bank or the facilities of a large bank, but they're a lot more agile in what they can do in regards to fixing a client's problems. Is that the sort of work that you get involved in when you're thinking around how to help challenger banks, how they can have that competitive advantage versus the much larger institutions?
Yeah, I suppose there's sort of there's two streams to the. I mean, we've also got, I should mention, Foundry, which is a sort of banking as a service platform, and that's the thing that we're building within 11FS, which is almost, it answers some of these questions, if you like. Like, so for us, where we're building digital propositions, we're using these, we call them building blocks, I suppose. You know, when I talk about the modular architecture, these are sort of building blocks that you then build on top of. So we're starting to build that internally as a sort of, as an answer to these challenges. But I suppose, you know, we have two streams. There's working with the big organizations that kind of, they want help in understanding how they can sort of, how they can do things quicker, I suppose. And I mean, for me, as a, like, I've never been a quote unquote consultant before. I've always been deeply suspicious of consultants because they usually arrive knowing the answer without really understanding the question, you know. And I think within banks, there's a lot of very smart people, and they often know what they want to do, what needs to be done, and they're just unable to do it. So then, you know, I found this, I've been on the other side of this, when the consultants arrive and they say, you need to do this. And you say, thank you, we know we need to do that. We can't do that. How about you help us? Yeah. So for me, it's really about understanding what the problem is and kind of helping them either find a way to kind of start to migrate to these ways of working, if you like, in these technologies. And sometimes it's, I mean, some of our most successful propositions have been when the bank has been able to essentially build something outside the bank. And it almost feels a little bit like a sort of, almost like a life raft, if you like. They're building a thing, and that's the thing that they're then going to jump onto while the monolith sinks, to be dramatic, you know, and then this is the new thing that sort of expands up, if you like. And that's worked very, very well. We do work with fintechs as well, absolutely. And that's a lot of that is about sort of proposition building and about research and about understanding the market and where they should sort of take things. But from a tech point of view, you know, it's sort of both of those things. It's sort of architecture and strategy, and then, yeah, often helping the big banks build something greenfield, if you like.
Yeah, well, and it's great just to get this bit of insights into the differences, but also, you know, the work that you guys do that can help across the whole industry. And so moving on to the third part of the podcast, which is our career advice. You know, you guys especially are growing at a rate of knots, and so I imagine I know your diary is always pretty busy having to do interviews. So what advice can you give our listeners who are, you know, entering either their first job or now their second or third job? When you're interviewing, what are the things that you really look for that people can take on board to help them stand out from the crowd?
Goodness, it's a good question, actually, and I can only imagine things have changed quite a lot since I was a graduate. I suppose for me, one of the things I see often is that, or for myself, one of the marks of a sort of senior engineer, I think, is they tend to start caring less about the technology, because the technology is a tool, if you like. So it's like when I was more junior, I cared a lot more about languages and about using different tools and about frameworks. Whereas actually, that now, I see in sort of some of our team, it's like, well, this is the problem we've got to solve. Yeah, we could use that, but I'm not going to get hung up on using that. So I think it's certainly, as it's more junior, it's getting that broad range of just understanding technology and also, you know, ideally finding a role where you get to see the impact of what you do firsthand. I think that's really, really important, because it's, you know, seeing that, you know, you have the word agile has been somewhat burnt because all the banks did agile, said they're agile, weren't really agile. Everybody working there said this agile stuff doesn't work. You know, well, you never really did it, did you? But if you can actually find a small organization or a small organization that's part of a bigger one, because, you know, in reality, a big organization or a big bank is actually just lots and lots of little organizations. So if you can find somewhere where you get to iterate, see the impact of what you do, and work with sort of smart people. I think that's the sweet spot for me, I think. In terms of what I look for, yes, it's people who want to solve problems, people who want to build stuff, rather than people who want to be. No, you want people who are interested in technology, but not necessarily technology for its own sake. I mean, I think there is a place for that. There are software companies where they are building software for others, but I think for me, it's solving real world problems and sort of human problems, if you like, with technology. And for me, it's something I try and do is make software simple, so that, like, in my organization, like my colleagues who are non-technical, I want to make it very clear that actually this is not simple, but give them a reference. I mean, I remember sort of doing a presentation, I call it conversational cloud for consultants. So it's like, you need something where if people are talking about cloud technology, for instance, you need to understand what they're talking about. You don't need to understand all the details, but you need to understand enough to be able to reason about it and sort of not get bamboozled, should we say.
Yeah, and on that latter point, I couldn't agree with you more. It's that broad understanding, being able to translate technical language into plain English. One of the things we educate a lot of our more junior candidates on is don't use buzzwords for the sake of buzzwords, and don't try and overcomplicate your skill set for thinking that will make you stand out. In fact, if you can explain things clearer and simpler, you are going to get further in your interview process than trying to confuse yourself and the person you're interviewing with. So that clarity of thought also sort of stands out.
Nobody will ever thank you for complexity. It's like, oh, this is complex, isn't that good? In fact, actually, I heard something or read something a few years ago which sort of articulated something that I'd always felt, which was that, like, a successful complex system, you never start out to build something complex. It comes from some simple things that you have combined into something complex. And for me, one of my colleagues said this, I think last year, talking about, you want simplicity, you want software that sort of fits in your head, if you like. So if someone's doing some work, you need to be able to look at that and go, I understand all of that, rather than, we're trying to solve real world problems here, if you like. So don't go and build something complicated and what I describe as over-engineered. Just solve the problem.
Yeah.
And then if you do that in the right way, you can iterate on it. And if you need to change it, you can change it. But the main thing for me is the simplicity and being able to change things and the loose decoupling, not something clever and complex.
Yeah. Again, and I couldn't agree with you more. So, wow, look, time has flown by. That's coming up to the end of our podcast. And thank you, Nick, because, the notes are taken down. And one of the things that really stand out are the three values: autonomy, mastery, and purpose, that we discussed at the beginning of the show. I think that really resonates for most people. If you can find places where you have the autonomy, you can master your trade, and you have a purpose, and the feedback loop that you mentioned. Purpose isn't about just what you want. It's also, can you get recognized for that, and do people appreciate the value that you're putting in? And moving on to the last bits of feedback or advice, getting that broad range of technologies and build stuff to solve a problem. I guess for many of our listeners, if they're the takeaways you can get from that will put them in really good stead, I guess. Is there any last closing comments from you when you're thinking around the work that you're doing and the listeners that we have, our STEM graduates, for the show?
I don't know, really. I think I've sort of put it all on the table, really. I mean, as I say, the graduate world has changed a bit since I was there. But I think technology is a really exciting place to be now. I think there's just so many different directions. I think it's always does it a disservice to talk about technology and engineering. It's like, it's so broad, front end, back end, platform, etc., etc. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But I think just sort of be curious.
Brilliant. Well, Nick, thank you so much. That's been a really, really interesting conversation. And as I say, the journey of not only yourself through large finance banks through to 11FS, but also how it's changing the landscapes and that career advice for our graduates. So, Nick, thank you for being on the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And to our listeners, that's another episode of our Future Tech podcast series. As hopefully most of you know now, the podcast is on our landing page, arrowspodcast.com. and that's embedded in now 22 universities on the career portals across the UK and Netherlands, and on our Spotify channel, which can also be found on our LinkedIn posts and on the Arrows podcast page. So everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode, and here's to the next one.
Thank you for listening to Future Tech with Charlie Sell, a podcast from Arrows Group Global. Please subscribe to this podcast so that you never miss an episode. Arrows Group is a global technology recruitment and workforce solutions provider who focus on people at the heart of all our interactions. With in-depth technology expertise and global candidate communities, we offer bespoke solutions to every client and candidate. To find out more, visit arrowsgroup.com.